The night was deep, the road desolate, and the snow relentless, covering every trace of life. In the dim glow of a distant street lamp, a frail silhouette emerged, a starving German shepherd, dragging a tattered cardboard box through the frozen street. Its paws trembled, leaving shallow imprints in the ice, but it refused to stop. It had a purpose. Inside that box was something that would break hearts. And just then, a man stepped out of a nearby gas station, his gaze locking onto the struggling dog. He had no idea that this moment would change everything. The wind howled through the empty road, sweeping up thick sheets of snow that swallowed everything in sight. The world was silent, save for the eerie whistle of the wind cutting through the skeletal trees lining the highway. A lone gas station stood against the elements, its neon sign flickering weakly, the only source of warmth for miles. Inside, Jake sighed as he wiped his hands on a rag, finishing up his nightly routine. The register was counted, the shelves restocked, just another uneventful night. Jake had worked this job for years, and he was used to the stillness, the quiet, the kind of solitude that made some men uneasy but felt almost comfortable to him. But tonight, something felt off. There was a heaviness in the air, a weight pressing against his chest, a feeling that something unseen was moving through the darkness. Shaking off the thought, he grabbed the garbage bag and stepped outside. The cold hit him immediately, sharp, unforgiving, the kind of cold that had no mercy. His boots crunched against the ice as he made his way to the dumpster behind the station. That's when he saw it. A lone struggle. At first it was just a shadow, barely distinguishable against the storm. Then, as the headlights of a passing truck illuminated the road for a brief second, Jake saw it clearly. A German shepherd, thin to the point of starvation, its ribs visible even beneath its matted fur. Each step it took was agonizingly slow, its body swaying with the effort of movement. But what stopped Jake in his tracks was what the dog was dragging. A cardboard box. The box wasn't small, and from the way the dog struggled, it was heavy enough to require effort. Its edges were damp, the flaps barely holding together. But the dog refused to let it go. Jake stood frozen, watching as the animal inched forward. A car approached from the distance. Its headlights shone bright against the snow, momentarily illuminating the frail dog and the battered box. And then, just like that, it sped past. The driver had seen it. There was no way they hadn't. But they kept going. Jake's jaw clenched. Another pair of headlights appeared. A truck this time. The vehicle barreled forward, its tires crunching over the icy road. The German shepherd barely managed to step aside as the truck whooshed past, sending a spray of snow and ice into the air. The dog flinched but kept moving forward. Jake felt something tighten in his chest. How long had this creature been dragging that box through the storm? How many people had looked but not seen? The fall. The dog pushed forward, step by agonizing step. Its movements were sluggish, its breath coming out in weak, misty puffs. It was barely hanging on. Jake took a step forward, his instinct screaming at him to act. But before he could move, the dog staggered, swayed, and collapsed. The cardboard box tipped slightly, landing at an awkward angle against the ice. The German shepherd lay motionless beside it, its sides barely rising and falling. Jake didn't hesitate. He ran. The world around him blurred as he sprinted across the icy pavement, his boots sliding slightly with each hurried step. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. He reached the dog within seconds and dropped to his knees in the snow. The wind howled around them, whipping against his jacket as he leaned down, his breath forming quick, uneven clouds in the freezing air. Up close, the dog looked even worse. Its fur was soaked through, its body skeletal. There were old scars visible through the tangled patches of fur. This was a dog that had suffered. But it wasn't looking at him. Its weak, glassy, amber eyes were focused on the box. Jake swallowed. His fingers trembled as he slowly reached toward the flaps of the box. Something deep in his gut told him this moment mattered. That whatever was inside was the reason this dog had fought through the storm. And maybe, just maybe, God had led him here to see it. Jake knelt beside the battered box, the cold biting into his knees as he pressed them against the frozen ground. The snow swirled around him, thick and relentless, muffling every sound except the howling wind. His breath came out in sharp, uneven puffs, mixing with the icy air. The German shepherd beside him lay still, its thin body barely rising and falling with each shallow breath. It had nothing left to give. But even in its final moments of exhaustion, its amber eyes never wavered from the box. Jake hesitated only a second before reaching forward, his fingers numb as they peeled back the damp, crumbling flaps. And then his world stopped. Fragile lives on the brink. Two tiny golden retriever puppies were huddled inside, their damp fur clinging to their fragile bodies. They were too small, too young. Their little forms were curled into one another, as if trying to create warmth that no longer existed. Jake's stomach twisted. They had been out here too long. The larger pup, a tiny thing with a faint white patch on its forehead, shifted weakly, letting out the softest, most pitiful whimper Jake had ever heard. The sound was barely louder than the whispering snow, barely there at all. But the other... Jake felt his chest tighten. The second pup wasn't moving. His hands trembled as he reached in, gently brushing his fingertips against the smaller body. Ice cold. He pressed two fingers lightly against its fragile chest. No movement, no breath, no heartbeat. His throat clenched. No. Jake carefully lifted the unmoving pup, cradling it in his hands, willing it to stir, to prove him wrong. But it remained still. The wind screamed around him. The cold seeped deeper into his skin, but all he could hear was the pounding of his own heartbeat in his ears. The witness of suffering. A faint, weak whimper pulled him from his spiraling thoughts. Jake's gaze snapped back to the German shepherd. It still hadn't moved, its body stretched out against the ice. It was barely clinging to consciousness, and yet its eyes were locked on the tiny, lifeless pup in Jake's hands. A quiet sound escaped from its throat, a broken, exhausted whine. Jake felt his stomach turn. This wasn't just a dog that had come across two abandoned puppies. It had known. It had fought to get them here. It had dragged this box across the frozen wasteland, using the last of its strength to carry hope through the storm, and despite everything, despite its suffering, it had come too late. Jake gritted his teeth. His grip tightened around the little body in his hands. No, he refused to accept this. The shepherd had risked everything. It had believed there was a chance, and so would he. No time to lose. Jake quickly tucked both puppies into his coat, pressing them against the warmth of his chest. The smaller one, the lifeless one, felt far too light, far too fragile. But the other was still breathing, still fighting, and that meant Jake couldn't stop. His gaze shifted to the German shepherd. It needed help just as much as they did, but carrying the dog wouldn't be easy. It was large, even in its frail state, and Jake already had his arms full. He hesitated. The dog needed a chance, but if he took too long... A car engine rumbled in the distance. Jake's head snapped up just in time to see headlights approaching. A pickup truck. The first sign of life he'd seen on this road all night. He acted on instinct. Raising one arm, he waved frantically, signaling for help. The truck's headlights illuminated the scene, him, kneeling in the snow, the collapsed shepherd at his side, the box barely holding together. For a split second, Jake felt hope. Then, without slowing, the truck sped past. Jake's breath caught. The tail lights vanished into the storm. He sat there for a second, disbelief washing over him like ice. They had seen him, seen the suffering laid bare on the road, and yet they had driven away. Jake clenched his jaw. The shepherd let out another weak sound. It had known. This whole time, it had known. How many people had passed before Jake? How many cars had ignored the struggling dog, dragging this box across the ice? How long had it been out here, searching for help, only to be met with indifference? Jake swallowed hard. Not anymore, not tonight. He turned back to the dog. "Come on, big guy," he murmured. "You're not staying here." With a grunt, he bent down, hooking his arms beneath the shepherd's frail body. It was lighter than it should have been. too light. The dog didn't resist. It barely stirred, its energy spent. Jake pulled it up, shifting the weight until he had it draped over his shoulder, his other arm securely pressing the puppies against his chest. He staggered slightly under the weight, but he didn't stop. He wouldn't stop. With quickened steps, he turned toward the gas station, the neon sign glowing faintly through the storm. He didn't know why he had been placed here tonight, didn't know if it was just chance, or if something greater had led him to this moment. But he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't leaving them behind. Into the light. The wind howled, trying to steal the warmth from his body, but Jake pressed forward. His boots slipped against the ice, but he held firm. The German Shepherd remained motionless over his shoulder, but he could still hear its faint, shallow breathing. The puppies, one weak but alive, the other still and unmoving, were cradled against his chest, close enough for him to feel the slightest stirrings of life. And in the distance, the glow of the gas station grew stronger. He pushed forward, step by step, until finally, the glass door swung open with a rush of warmth, and Jake stumbled inside. His body ached. His breath came in ragged gasps. Snow and ice clung to his clothes, but they had made it. For the first time all night, the wind outside sounded less like an ending, and more like the beginning of something else. Jake stumbled into the gas station, the warmth inside instantly clashing against the icy chill clinging to his skin. His breath came in ragged gasps, his arms trembling from the weight of the German Shepherd draped over his shoulder and the two fragile puppies pressed against his chest. The battered cardboard box hung loosely from his grip, the bottom sagging from the moisture that had soaked through. Snow dripped from his coat, forming small puddles on the linoleum floor. But none of that mattered. The only thing that mattered was time. Jake kicked the door shut with his foot, sealing out the raging storm. Then, without hesitation, he rushed toward the back of the station, where an old space heater stood in the small storage room. He dropped to his knees, his fingers fumbling as he cranked the heater up to full power. The coils glowed an angry red, spilling much-needed warmth into the air. Jake shrugged off his heavy coat, using it to create a barrier between the cold tile and the two puppies as he carefully set them down. His hands were shaking, his breath uneven. One of them, the slightly bigger one, let out a faint whimper. The other, Jake swallowed hard. Still, too still. Desperate measures. No, not yet. Jake pressed two fingers to the smaller pup's ribcage, his own heartbeat hammering in his ears. No movement, no breath. His stomach clenched, but he wasn't going to let this happen. Not if he could do something about it. Frantically, his mind scoured through memories, searching for anything useful. And then he remembered. A video he had watched years ago about treating hypothermia in puppies. They needed heat, they needed circulation, and sometimes they needed a jump start. Jake's fingers curled into fists before he forced himself to act. He carefully cupped the tiny, lifeless pup in his hands, bringing it as close as he could to the heat. Then, with gentle precision, he began rubbing small, firm circles over its chest. Come on. He adjusted the pressure, his fingers moving with urgency but care. Come back. Nothing. Jake gritted his teeth, adjusting his technique. He lowered his head slightly, listening closely, hoping for anything. Still nothing. A weight pressed against his chest, something deep and painful. He wasn't going to let this happen. He refused to let this happen. A silent plea. A low whimper broke through the silence. Jake glanced sideways. The German Shepherd, now lying weakly beside the heater, was watching him. Its amber eyes, dull with exhaustion, held something heartbreaking. Hope, desperation. Shadow's body trembled as it dragged itself closer until its damp nose brushed against the motionless puppy. Then, with infinite gentleness, it nudged the tiny body. A soft whine escaped its throat, a plea. Jake felt something crack inside him. The dog understood. It knew what was happening. It had brought them here to be saved. Jake swallowed hard. His own emotions threatened to overwhelm him, but he forced them down. He couldn't afford to feel right now. He had to keep trying. 30 seconds. Jake pressed gently but firmly against the pup's ribs, repeating the motion. He counted in his head. 1, 2, 3. His breath was shallow, his movement steady. It had to work. It had to. Another 10 seconds. Nothing. Shadow whined softly. Jake pushed harder, adjusting the pressure. Another 10 seconds. Still nothing. His vision blurred at the edges. Another 10. And then a twitch. Jake froze. His hands hovered over the tiny body, his breath caught in his throat. Then, so faintly he almost missed it, a tiny, broken gasp. His heart nearly stopped. The puppy's little chest rose, then fell, then rose again. Shadow let out a choked whimper, nudging the pup again. A sound, weak but real, escaped the tiny creature's mouth. A whimper. It was alive. Relief and remorse. Jake let out a sharp exhale, his hands shaking as he gently pulled the pup closer to the heater. Relief crashed over him so hard it made him dizzy. He had done it. They had done it. But even as his body sagged from the weight of it all, his gaze fell back onto the box, onto the other puppy, the one that hadn't made it. Jake's chest tightened painfully. For every miracle, there was a loss. He swallowed, his throat tight. Carefully, he reached out and lifted the small, unmoving body from the damp cardboard. It was so light in his hands, too light. Jake's fingers gently brushed over the soft fur, his touch reverent. "I'm sorry, little guy," he whispered. "I should have gotten there sooner." Shadow whimpered softly, its muzzle pressing against the lifeless form. Jake let out a slow breath, rubbing a hand over his face. He had done everything he could, but that didn't make this easier. The weight of survival. Minutes passed. The air inside the gas station was thick with warmth and silence, the kind that held both victory and grief. The revived puppy now rested on a pile of towels, its tiny body still trembling but alive. Shadow had stopped whimpering. It now lay still, its eyes half-lidded, as if finally allowing itself to rest. Jake ran a tired hand through his hair, staring at the quiet scene before him. The storm raged on outside, the wind rattling against the windows. But in here, something had changed. They had made it through the worst. And yet in the pit of Jake's stomach he knew this wasn't over, because surviving the storm was only the beginning. Chapter 4. The Past of a Wanderer. The gas station was eerily quiet, save for the occasional hum of the space heater working overtime to push back the remnants of the winter storm that raged outside. The air smelled of damp fur and melted snow, and for the first time in hours, Jake allowed himself to exhale. The two puppies had been stabilized. One had survived against the odds, while the other had slipped away before Jake could reach them. It still weighed on him, that loss. But right now, his attention was on something else. Shadow. Jake had seen strays before. Occasionally, dogs would show up around the station, sniffing for scraps or shelter before disappearing into the night. But this dog was different. Shadow lay stretched out on the pile of towels Jake had set down earlier, his body too still, his breathing slow but steady. Now, in the glow of the heater's warm light, Jake could finally take a closer look at the creature who had fought so desperately to save those puppies. Shadow was painfully thin, his ribs pressing against his skin like sharp ridges, his fur patchy in places where old scars had healed unevenly. There were marks across his back, some fresher than others, and one ear had a jagged tear, as if something had bitten or ripped through it long ago. Jake knelt beside him, staring at the dog's frail form. How long had he been on his own? What had he endured before this? His hand hesitated before reaching toward the dog, offering nothing but a simple, quiet presence. "You're safe now, buddy," he murmured. "No more running." Shadow didn't move. His amber eyes flickered open just barely and met Jake's. Something about that look sent a sharp pang through Jake's chest. It was a look he had seen before, in the mirror, years ago. It was the look of someone who had lost too much, who had stopped believing in kindness because it had never lasted long enough to mean anything. Jake had been there once. He had known what it felt like to be tossed aside, to have no one left, to wonder if the world had already decided it was done with him. And now, here was Shadow, a living, breathing testament to that same kind of suffering. Jake sighed, pushing himself to his feet. "You must be thirsty." He grabbed a bowl, filled it with warm water, and set it down near the dog. Shadow's nose twitched, but he didn't drink right away. Instead, he looked at Jake. Not at the water, not at the food Jake had also placed beside him. At him. It was a look of both gratitude and doubt, as if Shadow had learned that good things never came without a price. Jake swallowed, suddenly uncomfortable under that gaze. He forced a small smile and nudged the bowl forward. "Go on, it's for you." Shadow hesitated a moment longer, then lowered his head and began to drink. The sight, simple as it was, sent another pang through Jake's chest. How long had it been since Shadow last had fresh water? Since someone had cared enough to offer him anything? Jake sat down on the floor, stretching out his legs with a heavy sigh. His body ached from carrying both the dog and the puppies through the storm, and exhaustion gnawed at him, but his mind refused to rest. Piece by piece, the story of Shadow began forming in his head. Shadow wasn't the puppy's mother, that much was obvious. But despite having no obligation, he had protected them, had dragged them across a frozen road, risking everything to find shelter. Why? Jake studied him again, the deep scars, the wary nature, the haunted look in his eyes. Shadow had once belonged to someone, that much was clear. But had he been abandoned? Had he escaped from somewhere worse? Maybe he had simply stumbled upon the puppies, seen them in danger, and chosen to do something no one else would. Jake clenched his jaw, a familiar anger stirring inside him. What kind of world left creatures like this to fend for themselves? He thought back to the truck that had driven past them earlier, the drivers who had seen but ignored. He thought of all the people who must have passed Shadow on the road before he reached the gas station, all the ones who had let him keep walking, starving, suffering. The world had been cruel to Shadow, but maybe, just maybe, Jake could change that. Leaning back against the wall, he looked over at the dog. "I don't know what's going to happen next, big guy," he murmured, "but I promise you this, you're not alone anymore." For the first time, Shadow didn't just watch him. He closed his eyes and rested his head against the blanket. A moment later, his tail gave the smallest, most hesitant wag. The days that followed were unlike any Jake had experienced in years. His life had always been a routine of solitude, early mornings, long hours, and nights spent alone in the dim glow of the gas station's fluorescent lights. But now, that quiet, predictable world had been disrupted by the presence of two fragile souls and one wounded warrior. The first morning, as the storm subsided, Jake took Blaze and Shadow outside. The air was crisp, the sky washed clean by the night's relentless snowfall. Everything was still, untouched, a frozen world that seemed too serene compared to the chaos of the past few hours. But there was something Jake still had to do. Carrying a small wrapped bundle in his arms, he walked to the back of the gas station where the snow was less thick. The earth beneath was frozen but not unbreakable. With quiet determination, Jake dug into the cold ground, his breath coming in steady clouds as he worked. Shadow sat beside him, watching, his body still weak, but his amber eyes solemn. He hadn't left Jake's side all morning. When the hole was deep enough, Jake gently placed Frost inside. The little pup was wrapped in a soft cloth, as if merely drifting into sleep. Jake took a deep breath, swallowing the lump in his throat. He had seen death before. Life on the road had hardened him, but this loss felt different, because it hadn't been inevitable. It had been preventable. If only someone had helped sooner, if only the world had been kinder. Jake knelt beside the small grave and murmured, "Sleep well, little guy. I promise. I'll take care of Blaze for you." Beside him, Shadow lowered his head, exhaling a quiet breath as if understanding. Together they sat in silence for a moment longer. Then Jake slowly covered the grave, pressing the snow down gently, his fingers lingering for a moment before he finally stood. He had never prayed much, But in that moment he hoped Frost had found a better place, a place warmer than this one. A new rhythm. Life at the gas station gradually settled into a new rhythm. Blaze, despite his difficult start, was resilient. The tiny pup bounced back with a tenacity that surprised Jake. Within just a few days, the weak, shivering creature had transformed into a bundle of energy, tumbling clumsily across the station floor. He explored every corner of the small space, his tail wagging enthusiastically at every new discovery. An old mop, a pile of receipts, Jake's shoelaces. His favorite, however, was Shadow. The little pup adored him, trailing after the German shepherd like a small shadow of his own. Despite still recovering, Shadow tolerated Blaze's antics with quiet patience. He let the pup nuzzle against him, bite at his ears, and even curl up beside him when he slept. At first, Jake had worried about Shadow. The dog still flinched sometimes when Jake moved too quickly. He still hesitated before accepting food, still woke up in the middle of the night, ears perked, body tense as if expecting danger. But with time, that started to change. The first time Shadow approached Jake willingly, the man nearly didn't notice. He had been sitting at the counter, absently flipping through an old magazine, when suddenly a head rested against his knee. Jake froze. Shadow had placed himself beside him, unprompted. His eyes were half-lidded, his body relaxed in a way that had been unthinkable just days ago. Jake's lips parted slightly, caught between surprise and something far more profound. Trust. Slowly, he reached down, running his fingers through the shepherd's coarse fur. "Looks like you're finally starting to believe I'm not the bad guy," he murmured. Shadow made a low sound, not quite a whimper, not quite a sigh, just acknowledgement. Jake smiled. It was progress. Something new. Days turned into nights, nights into mornings, and for the first time in longer than he cared to admit, Jake didn't feel completely alone. Blaze woke him up early, every morning without fail. The pup would wiggle his way onto the cot Jake kept in the storage room, pawing at his chest until he groaned and sat up. And every morning without fail, Shadow would already be waiting nearby. He never jumped on the bed, never begged for attention, but he was there. That small, constant presence meant more than Jake could put into words. It wasn't just about taking care of them anymore. Somewhere along the way they had become a part of him. The tiny, energetic ball of fur that greeted him with boundless excitement every morning. The silent, steadfast guardian that watched over him even when he wasn't looking. Jake never thought he needed anyone. Now he wasn't so sure. The question that lingered. One evening, as Jake sat outside the station, Blaze curled up on his lap and Shadow lying beside his feet, a thought crept into his mind. Could he keep them? The reality was, this wasn't a real home. It was a temporary stop in the middle of nowhere. A gas station wasn't a place to raise a dog, let alone two. They deserved more. They deserved a real home, a yard to run in, people who could give them everything they needed. And Jake, was he that person? He frowned, staring out at the road. He had never been one to put down roots. He wasn't the type to settle. So what was he doing here, considering something so permanent? His hand drifted to Blaze's fur, idly stroking the little pup's head as it slept. Shadow let out a deep sigh, stretching his legs but staying close. Jake glanced at them both. Could he let them go? Or perhaps the real question was, did he want to? Jake wasn't sure of the answer yet, but deep down he had a feeling it had already been decided. The morning was still, the air crisp with the remnants of the storm that had raged only days before. The sky, once a swirling chaos of white and grey, had settled into a pale, icy blue, and the snow-covered landscape stretched endlessly in every direction. It was peaceful, quiet, but inside Jake another storm brewed. He stood at the entrance of the gas station, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the horizon. This should have been an easy decision. A few days ago he would have scoffed at the idea of keeping them. He had always been a man who walked alone, content with the solitude that came with his life. No responsibilities, no attachments, just the road, the station, and the occasional fleeting conversation with travelers passing through. But now, Blaze was a part of his mornings. The tiny pup would wake before dawn, wiggling his way under the blankets, pawing at Jake's chest until he groaned and gave in, scratching his little head. And Shadow. Shadow never begged for attention, never demanded anything, but he was always there, sitting by the cot, watching, waiting, guarding, as if silently making sure Jake was still there. Jake exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. He wasn't the same man he was before the storm, and yet the decision loomed over him like a weight he couldn't shake. He turned at the sound of tires crunching against the snow. A pickup truck rumbled into the lot, the bright red logo of a local animal rescue center painted on the side. The engine hummed for a moment before shutting off, and the door creaked open. A woman stepped out, bundled in a thick coat, her breath visible in the frigid air. She was in her 50s, with kind eyes and a patient smile, the type of person who had probably spent years saving animals others had abandoned. Jake knew why she was here. She had come to take them away. The decision that could change everything. Jake stayed rooted in place as the woman approached, brushing snow from her sleeves. She stopped a few feet away, glancing down at the two dogs. Blaze was curled up near Jake's feet, blinking sleepily against the sunlight. Shadow sat just behind him, alert, ears twitching, his body tense as if he already knew what was coming. The woman crouched, offering her hand. Blaze perked up immediately, his tail wagging as he sniffed at her fingers. Shadow, however, didn't move. His amber eyes flicked to Jake first, then back to the woman. Mistrust flickered in his gaze. She smiled warmly. "You did a good thing, bringing them in from the cold." Jake shoved his hands into his jacket pockets, shifting his weight. "Yeah, well, they found me first." The woman chuckled. "That's usually how it happens." She glanced at Blaze, scratching under his chin, then at Shadow, who had yet to budge. "The shepherd, he's been through a lot, hasn't he?" Jake nodded. "Yeah, he's a fighter, though. That much is obvious." The woman straightened, dusting snow off her gloves. "Well," she said, her voice gentle but firm, "we can take them back with us. Get them checked out. Find them good homes. They'll be safe, I promise you that." Jake's jaw tightened. This was what was supposed to happen. This was the right thing to do. Shadow and Blaze deserved a real home, a family, somewhere warm, safe, somewhere better than a gas station in the middle of nowhere. So why did this feel wrong? He looked down at Shadow, at the way the dog's ears were pulled back slightly, his muscles tense, his eyes darting between him and the rescue worker, like he was preparing for something inevitable, like he had been here before. Jake had seen that look before, in people, in himself. Shadow had known abandonment more than once, and now it was happening again. Jake swallowed. His hand twitched at his side. Blaze let out a small whimper, pressing against Jake's boot. Damn it, he couldn't do this. The question that changed everything. Jake knelt, reaching out to scratch behind Shadow's ears. The dog flinched, just barely, but he didn't pull away. Jake exhaled, then murmured, "You want to go, big guy?" Shadow didn't move, didn't wag his tail, didn't show any sign of excitement. He simply stared at Jake. Then, slowly, his gaze drifted to Blaze, and something in Jake's chest tightened painfully. It wasn't just about him anymore. Shadow wasn't thinking about himself. He was thinking about Blaze. The little pup had been his responsibility, the one thing he had fought to protect. If they left, they would be separated. Jake clenched his jaw. A dog like Shadow, who had risked everything for others, who had endured more than any creature should. What did a dog like that really need? Did he need a nice suburban home? A family with a fenced yard? Or had he already found what he needed? Jake looked up at the woman, and he knew. He exhaled, straightened, and ran a hand through his hair. "They're staying with me." The woman's eyebrows raised slightly, but she didn't look surprised. If anything, she smiled. "You sure?" Jake looked down at them. Blaze, now nibbling at the edge of his boot, happy, oblivious, alive. Shadow, watching, waiting, still unsure if he could believe what was happening. Jake nodded. Yeah. His voice was steadier now, certain. I'm sure. The woman studied him for a long moment. Then, with a warm smile, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a business card. If you ever need anything, vet recommendations, training tips, anything, give me a call. Jake took the card, slipping it into his pocket without looking at it. Appreciate it. She gave one last scratch behind Blaze's ears, then stepped back. They're lucky, you know, she said. Jake let out a breath. No, he said quietly. I think I'm the lucky one. A choice that felt like home. As the truck rumbled away, Jake stood there, watching the taillights fade down the highway. The wind had died down. The air was still, quiet. He glanced down. Blaze was gnawing at a loose string on his jeans, oblivious to the weight of the moment. Shadow, however, was still watching the road. Jake knelt beside him. Ain't gotta look anymore, buddy. You're home. For a moment, Shadow didn't move. Then slowly his tail wagged. Just once, just enough. Jake smiled. Yeah, they were home. The days passed, and with them life took on a new shape. A shape Jake had never expected, but one that, oddly enough, he found himself growing into. The gas station, once a cold, lifeless place, had become something different. It wasn't much, but with a little effort, Jake had carved out a space for all three of them. He cleared out the back storage room, throwing down old blankets and pillows to make a warm sleeping area. He found an old dog bed in the back of his truck from years ago, something he had bought on impulse but never used. Shadow claimed it immediately, curling into it like it was the first real comfort he had known in a long time. And Blaze? Blaze had no interest in dog beds. He preferred to sleep directly on top of Jake. It started as an accident. One morning, Jake woke up to find the tiny pup sprawled across his chest, snoring softly. He had tried moving him back to the makeshift bed, but Blaze would always find his way back, curling against him like a child afraid of the dark. Jake gave up after the third night. They had settled into a routine. Mornings started with Blaze bounding around the gas station, turning everything into a toy. His tail was a constant blur, his energy endless. Shadow, as always, was different. He didn't play the way Blaze did. He didn't demand attention, didn't whine for food or leap onto Jake's lap. But he was always there. Wherever Jake went, Shadow followed. Not close enough to be underfoot, but always within reach, watching, guarding. At first, Jake thought it was just Shadow's nature. Some dogs were like that, reserved, cautious, slow to trust. But then he started noticing things. The sleepless watcher. Shadow never truly slept, not the way a dog should. Most nights, Jake would wake in the middle of the night to find Shadow sitting up, ears perked, staring out into the snow-covered landscape beyond the gas station window. He was still, silent, like he was waiting. At first, Jake dismissed it. Maybe the dog just wasn't comfortable yet. Maybe it would take time for him to let go of whatever survival instincts had kept him alive for so long. But then came the nights when Jake woke up and found Shadow at the door. Not scratching at it, not whining, just standing there, listening, waiting. Jake would whisper his name, and Shadow would turn, his tail flicking just slightly, like he was reassuring himself that Jake was still there. But then, almost immediately, his attention would shift back to the storm outside. It was as if he was expecting someone, or maybe he was afraid of someone. Jake didn't know which possibility was worse. Echoes of the past. One evening, as Jake finished closing up the gas station for the night, he leaned against the counter, arms crossed, watching Shadow. The shepherd lay on his bed, but his ears twitched at every little sound. "All right," Jake said, more to himself than the dog. "What are you looking for, huh?" Shadow didn't move. Jake sighed, running a hand through his hair. "You had a home once, didn't you?" That would explain a lot. The hesitation, the quiet obedience, the way Shadow had instantly known what it meant to protect something. Maybe he had belonged to someone. Maybe he had lost them. Maybe they had left him behind. Jake exhaled, rubbing his face. He wanted to know the truth. But more than that, he wanted to know what Shadow was waiting for. Was it an old owner who might never come back? Or was it something worse, something that might one day find its way to them? Jake didn't have the answers, but something in his gut told him he was going to find out soon. The morning air was crisp, the last traces of winter still lingering in the wind as Jake stepped outside with Shadow. The German shepherd walked beside him, his movements steady but always alert, his ears flicking at the faintest sounds. Since the storm, Shadow had started trusting Jake more, but there were still moments, small moments of hesitation, of old fears creeping back in. Jake had seen it in the way Shadow flinched at loud noises, or how he always slept with one eye half open, as if expecting danger. Jake had tried to push aside his questions about Shadow's past, but deep down he knew the dog had been through something bad. And that morning he found out exactly what. A ghost from the past. They had barely walked a few steps when a sound broke through the quiet, the low rumble of an approaching engine. Jake glanced up just as an old, battered pickup truck rolled down the highway, its dented body coated in mud and rust. He wouldn't have thought twice about it until he felt Shadow tense beside him. The dog froze. Every muscle in his body went rigid, his ears flattened, his hackles rising. Then a growl. Not a warning growl, not the kind dogs let out when they were uncertain. This was a deep, guttural, unmistakable sound of fear and hatred. Jake's breath hitched. Shadow took a step back, his body pressing against Jake's leg, his eyes locked on the truck as if he was seeing a ghost. The truck slowed. Jake felt it before it happened. The moment stretched long and heavy, like the air right before a thunderstorm. Then the truck came to a stop. The driver's side door creaked open. A man stepped out. A monster wearing a man's face. Jake knew trouble when he saw it. And this man, he was trouble. Middle-aged, rough-looking, a face that had seen too many fights and thrown just as many punches. He was broad-shouldered, thick with muscle that had started to go soft. His hair was buzzed short, his eyes cold, assessing, sharp. But the worst part was the way he smirked, a cruel, knowing smirk that curled across his face the second he laid eyes on Shadow. "Well, well," the man drawled, his voice low and gravelly. "Still alive, huh?" Jake's stomach dropped. This man knew Shadow. Shadow let out another growl, but this time he lowered his head, stepping behind Jake. Jake had never seen him react like this before, not to the storm, not to strangers, not even to the rescue worker who had come for him and Blaze. But now, Shadow was afraid. Jake clenched his jaw. No, not afraid. Terrified. His fingers twitched at his side, wanting nothing more than to curl into fists. "Who are you?" Jake asked, his voice cold. The man shrugged. "No one important. Just a guy who used to run a dog training business. Used to have a few working dogs, but not all of them made the cut." His eyes flicked to Shadow. Jake felt anger ignite in his chest. He knew. He knew exactly what kind of man this was. "You're his owner," Jake stated, his voice dangerously low. The man let out a short, mocking laugh. "Was. Used to be, but mutts like that?" He waved a hand dismissively. "Not worth the food it takes to feed 'em." Jake's jaw clenched so hard his teeth hurt. Not worth it. He looked down at Shadow, at the dog who had dragged a box of puppies through a storm, who had fought until his body gave out, who had survived despite everything. And this bastard had thrown him away. Jake's hands curled into fists. Shadow was shaking, his amber eyes locked on the man, but still staying close to Jake, like he was waiting for something bad to happen. Jake took a slow, controlled step forward, placing himself fully between them. "You have no right to be here," Jake said, his voice tight with fury. "He's not yours anymore." The man scoffed. "I never said I wanted him back. If you want to waste your time on a useless stray, be my guest." He turned back toward his truck, shaking his head. "People like you always crack me up, acting like these mutts are worth something." Jake's fists tightened, but before he could say anything, Shadow did. A sound low and deep, but this time not out of fear. Jake glanced down and saw Shadow's posture had changed. He was no longer cowering. no longer pressing himself against Jake for protection. His head was high, his body steady. His amber eyes were locked on the man, but they were no longer filled with fear. They were defiant. The man noticed too. He scoffed, but there was something hard in his expression now. He climbed back into his truck and muttered, "Enjoy your mutt." Then, with a roar of the engine, he was gone. Snow kicked up in his wake, dusting over the road, erasing the tracks he had left behind. Not a stray anymore. The silence stretched long after the truck disappeared. Jake turned to Shadow. The dog was still watching the road, his body still tense, his breathing uneven. Jake knelt, reaching out a hand. "Hey." Shadow hesitated. Then, slowly, he stepped forward and pressed his head against Jake's chest. Jake exhaled, his anger fading into something deeper, something raw. For the first time, Shadow had sought him out, not out of fear, but for comfort. Jake rested a hand on the shepherd's head, his fingers sinking into the rough fur. "You're safe, big guy," he murmured. "You're not going back there, ever." Shadow didn't move for a long moment. Then, finally, his body relaxed. Jake felt it, the way the tension drained from him, the way his weight settled, like he was finally letting go. Then Shadow lifted his head and looked at Jake, and for the first time there was no hesitation in his eyes. No doubt, no fear, only trust. Jake smiled faintly. "You're not a stray anymore, Shadow." The dog's tail flicked once, and Jake knew this was the real beginning. That night, as the world outside lay still beneath a thick blanket of snow, Jake stood at the entrance of the gas station, the cold wind brushing against his face. The storm had long passed, but the air was still crisp, filled with the lingering scent of winter. Blaze bounded around his feet, his tiny tail wagging furiously, completely unaware of the hardships that had brought him here. To him, the world was new, full of warmth, full of love. Shadow stood beside Jake, silent but steady. The shepherd's amber eyes reflected the glow of the station's neon lights, flickering with something Jake hadn't seen before, not just trust, but peace. Jake exhaled, shoving his hands into his jacket pockets. He looked down at Shadow, meeting his gaze. "Thank you." "That's what it felt like," Shadow was saying. "Thank you for not leaving me." Jake smiled. "Come on, let's go inside." The door swung shut behind them, sealing out the darkness and cold. Inside, the warmth wrapped around them, a quiet but undeniable reminder. They weren't alone anymore. A family isn't always made by blood. Sometimes it's built by compassion and love.